Chapter 3 Environmental Policy An Introduction and U.S. Environmental Policy by Amy Lian,
Kisa Bentricaliacorn,
Rachel Lau,
and Kristie Sun.
What is policy? Policy consists of a formal set of general plans and principles intended to address problems and guide decision-making. Two specific types of policy are public policy and environmental policy. Public policy is policy made by governments, while environmental policy is policy involving human interactions with the environment. Policy making can be important to solve serious environmental problems such as polluted rivers and beaches. The polluted rivers and beaches cause illnesses in humans and other animals, and policy making can help clean up these waters to prevent the illnesses from occurring. However, this is only one of many environmental problems. Due to population growth and resource consumption, environmental problems rose to a large scale. Therefore, environmental policies were created to try to lessen some of these environmental problems. Environmental policy aims to protect the environment's quality and the natural resources that people use. In Garrett Hardin's essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, he explained that common resources will eventually become overused and degraded, which is why guidelines are needed to prevent this tragedy, causing restriction of use and active management to be the main principles to environmental policy today. Public policy is also needed to protect resources because of the issue with free riders who avoid making sacrifices. The goals of environmental policy include protecting resources from the tragedy of the commons, promoting equity by removing free riders, and dealing with external costs.
Environmental policy comes from the three branches of government. Statutory law is created by the legislative branch. Legislation is approved or rejected by the executive branch. Regulations are specific rules based on statutory laws, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Many states with dense urban populations have strong environmental laws and well-funded environmental agencies. U.S. Constitution laid out several principles that have come to be especially relevant to environmental policy. The 14th Amendment prohibiting a state from denying equal protection of its laws to any person. This amendment provides the constitutional basis for the environmental justice movement. The Fifth Amendment ensures in part that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation, also known as takings clause, to ban not only the literal taking of private property, but also what is known as regulatory taking. A regulatory taking occurs when the government, by means of a law or regulation, deprives the property owner of some or all economic uses of that property.
The laws of U.S. environmental policy were created in three periods. The first U.S. environmental policy period involved the management of public lands, the westward expansion of the nation to promote settlement, and the extraction and use of the West's plentiful natural resources. During this time, the General Land Ordinances of 1785 and 1787, Homestead Act of 1862, Mineral Lands Act of 1866, and Timber Culture Act of 1873 were passed. In the second U.S. environmental policy period, the West became more populated. Its resources were very scarce, therefore public perception and government policy toward natural resources began to shift. The laws of this period were aimed to alleviate some of the environmental problems due to westward expansion. In 1891, Congress, to prevent overharvesting and protect forest watersheds, passed a law authorizing the presidents to create forest reserves, which were off-limiting to logging. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt created the first national wildlife refuge. Land management policies continued through the 20th century, targeting soil conservation in the Dust Bowl years, and they were extending through the Wilderness Act of 1964. The third U.S. environmental policy period responded largely to pollution. Several events triggered the increased awareness of environmental problems and brought about a shift in public priorities. Important changes in public policies included the 1962 publication of Silent Spring, a book by Rachel Carson, which awakened the public to negative ecological and health effects of pesticides and industrial chemicals. The Cuyahoga River, which was so polluted with oil and industrial waste that the river caught on fire near Cleveland, Ohio, many times. and an enormous oil spill off Pacific coast near Santa Barbara, California in 1969, which moved the public to prompt Congress and the President to do more to protect the environment.
NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, created an agency called the Council on Environmental Quality for federal action that might affect environmental quality. For this to happen, an environmental impact statement must be prepared, which forces agencies to evaluate impacts before developing new projects. Nixon called for a new approach on environmental policies and created the Environmental Protection Agency, which sets and enforces standards on pollution levels and raises awareness to the public. Because of the public demand for a better environment, thousands of laws have been passed in the U.S. One example is the Cuyahoga River, where legislation was needed. The Federal Water Pollution Control Acts and Clean Water Acts restricted pollution by regulating waste, and waterways began to recover. People felt that the environmental laws affected businesses because they were forced to make changes in equipment and processes to meet the environmental standards. Another example was the 1992 Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. There was an international conference with representatives from 179 nations. New policies to sustain the environment were developed. Sustainability sustains the environment while increasing standards of living. And that is the beginning of Chapter 3.